Hello, everybody. Am I in an okay spot now? Okay. This is like the worst time slot, right? Because everybody's anxious for lunch and you've been going out to the restroom and you see the buffet and your stomachs are grumbling. So I apologize. I will try to be brief and keep your mind off of lunch at least for 10 minutes, okay? My name is Vicki Cuscino. I am the Executive Director of Direct Center for Independence, which is the Center for Independent Living serving Southern Arizona, and also Executive Director of Counseling Directions, which is an entity that we founded to provide behavioral health counseling to individuals with disabilities, and the counseling is grounded in disability rights, independent living philosophy with a focus on disability identity. I also, just briefly about my background, I've been working in disability rights now for 20 years, and before that worked in the movement to end domestic violence and was a journalist before that. So I've been doing social justice work for a really long time. But I also, my younger brother, who was my very best friend in the entire world, worked as a first responder. He was a paramedic for years, and then a police officer, and then a homicide detective. So not that I know what it's like to be a first responder, but he was near and dear to my heart, and we talked every single day when he was alive, so I knew his life as well. So I was asked to talk about communicating with first responders, and I think what I'm planning to talk about kind of tag teams on the presentation before. You know, emergencies are really tough on everybody, and let's be honest, disability and the diverse disabilities can make first responders work a little bit more challenging, right, if we're not all prepared. It can be really difficult sometimes to determine, is somebody being aggressive because they're, you know, on illicit drugs and being aggressive, or do they have a traumatic brain injury or PTSD? And it becomes really difficult to kind of figure it out in the moment. And let's face it, police especially sometimes all first responders have to make split-second decisions, often with very little information. So I get that, but I also think like the program that the officer was talking about before me, it really requires a lot of training with first responders on dealing with all types of people. Now, my focus, of course, is disability and all types of disabilities. And the training is important because sometimes the answer to de-escalating a situation is counterintuitive to what first responders are trained to do. You know, and when somebody is not responding or following an order or answering questions, it might not because they don't want to comply. They may not hear what is going on. They may be on the spectrum and not understand. There could be a variety of reasons. It could be a mental health disability. So sometimes it's calmness, patience, and geographical containment that can help with this situation versus using more force. One thing about the training, and I know we've all, I think, heard some of the horror stories, and so I don't want to talk about those, but of, you know, too much force being used in situations with people with diverse disabilities. And training can help that, but it has to be ongoing to create that muscle memory. And And I experienced this the first time I was certified to teach nonviolent crisis intervention. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, it's so much to remember, and how am I going to do this? I have to train a bunch of people, but then also, do I actually feel confident in doing this, if the situation arises? And I found that because I was training all the time in doing it, when the situations came up, you don't even think about it. Like, you do have that muscle memory and just, follow that. But if you don't get the ongoing training, you can sometimes forget. And let's face it, dealing with diverse disabilities, they're not all the same. Even a spinal cord injury is not all the same for everybody with a spinal cord injury, right? Cerebral palsy, it manifests differently in everybody. So I have just general tips, and this is by no means even comprehensive, but some very general tips for first responders that can help with various disabilities, and that is, keeping your tone calm, speaking slowly, giving one command at a time. I was just in Los Angeles. My other brother and I meet there every year, and he was telling me a story about, he had just come back from Mexico, and it was the LA airport, and dealing with, he said it was a police officer, not a customs officer, but he kind of got lost in the area and was reading signs and had this interaction where, and he does not have a disability, but just the response, the officer actually asked him if he was stupid. And so he said, and was really trying to explain, I'm just lost. I'm reading the sign that says if I go out of this area, I can't return. And we were just talking about it, and he said, I really hope nobody, with, like a developmental disability or anybody experiences, that. And I hope that that's also not the norm, and I don't think it is these days. I think first responders are now getting diverse training. Again, I advocate for that to be ongoing. And then I will talk in a couple minutes about responsibilities of people with disabilities. The other thing is, for first responders, is to not use terms that can have multiple meanings. Use very concrete language so it can't be misunderstood. And, be empathetic, like show that you care. And I think in an emergency, the inclination is, and I'm thinking about an evacuation. I actually worked in California years ago and helped with at a shelter after one of the wildfires. A lot of individuals with disabilities were evacuated and in shelter without a lot of things that they needed, including wheelchairs and walkers, and there weren't arrangements for medication, and I'll talk about that. But there is, when you're evacuating, it's like you have to be quick, right? You have to get people out quickly. That's another time where it can be counterintuitive, depending on an individual's disability. That can actually create a lot of stress and could escalate something. So, depending on the situation, you might have to be prepared to take rest and try to keep the situation as calm as possible. Reassure older adults with disabilities that they can get assistance and not be taken to a nursing facility. Nobody wants to be taken out of their home and to a nursing facility where they lose all of their independence. That is a huge fear, especially of older adults, but often people with other significant disabilities as well. Something for individuals with dementia, as well as on the spectrum and even some mental health disabilities, and this could be a tough one, but when possible, turn off the sirens and lights. That is something that can really be upsetting for certain disabilities. And then also, always, whenever possible, make sure you're evacuating or taking people to the hospital or wherever with the equipment that they need. Whenever possible, if they use a wheelchair, a service animal, we shouldn't be separating people from their service animals, things like that. So now, tips for people with disabilities. Excuse me, I need a drink. As I said, I've been involved in disability rights now for 20 years. Director of a Center for Independent Living, but also an ADAPT activist for 20 years. Does anybody know what ADAPT is? Yay, woohoo. So for those of you who don't know, I mean, ADAPT is an activist group in the disability rights, disability justice movement, often thought of as kind of the radical arm of the disability rights movement. We engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. I'm telling you that for a reason, because I have a story. I believe very strongly in the principles of independent living, which are, informed choice. Everybody has a right to make decisions that affect, our lives, but we should have all the information about all viable options to do that. And consumer control, being in control of the life decisions. Dignity of risk, the right to take risks, make those informed choices and take risks and live with any consequences and learn from them, just like everybody else. And community integration, the being able to have equal opportunity to fully participate in all aspects of life in our community. With that comes responsibility. How many of you know who Justin Dart is? Yeah, Justin Dart is often called the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and he talked a lot about, not only civil rights, but our responsibility with those. And I have a quote from him, and he talked about it a lot. This is really just one. Civil rights are not a guarantee of the good life, but an equal opportunity and responsibility to participate in producing the good life for oneself and for all. So what I have to say, and I guess I should have disclosed at the beginning, I do have multiple invisible disabilities, although you might have figured it out by now. That's why I have notes, because the ADHD often takes control, and who knows where we'll end up if I don't follow my notes. If you haven't learned by now, as an individual with a disability, that you are and should be the expert on your own life, I want to try to spark the epiphany, because nobody knows you and your life better than you, and nobody is going to advocate for you and your rights better than you. And if you don't know how to do that, connect with a Center for Independent Living or another advocacy or activist group. Get connected and really learn how to stand up for yourself. I say that because with emergency preparedness, yes, I think first responders need lots of training, but who doesn't? We all need training, right? And I don't want to take away from that training. They need ongoing training, and we've come a long way. We have a long way to go. But we as people with disabilities have just as much, if not more, responsibility in planning for emergencies for ourselves and our families, okay? And there are lots of kits and guides and things that you can do, but I'll just touch on them briefly. You need to prepare. Know the risks that can happen, whether it's a personal emergency or a natural disaster, and make a plan. Part of that plan is establishing a support network and then an actual emergency kit. The personal support network, you should have at least one person, but recommended maybe 3 individuals that you could call on in an emergency to assist you. Like if you need assistance evacuating, and neighbors are often, the closest to you, so for evacuation, that would make sense. But then also emergency contacts, and one of those should not be in your immediate area in case of a natural disaster. That contact should be somewhere farther away, and those contacts should know everything. But it's up to you to inform them of anything that you need, medications, doctors, insurance, equipment that you need, how to operate your power wheelchair, anything like that. And don't just count on people to help. It's really develop a plan and ask people that you trust if they're willing to do it. Go over the plan with them and practice. Just like we had fire drills in school, practice the plan, because who knows what's going to happen in an emergency. I mean, stuff goes wrong and people aren't always thinking clearly. So it helps, just like I talked about the muscle memory with first responders, do the same thing with your personal support network. Make sure they know where your emergency kit is stored. And there are all kinds of lists and guides to help you prepare an emergency kit, and I'm not going to talk about that, except for the items that deal with communication. Your emergency contact should be in that kit with information, so any type of first responders, if they need that contact, can get it. Also, in regard to your medications and your health information or anything like that, laminate it. Who knows what kind of emergency you're going to be in, so laminate all of that information, have it in your kit. Instructions for any type of medical equipment or assistive technology that you have those instructions laminated. You should have all of your equipment labeled so the instructions can be matched up. I know for people with disabilities who use the equipment every day, you don't really think about it, but in an emergency, if you're not able to communicate it, not everybody is going to know what the devices are or how to operate them. You should have a little bit, if you can't communicate on your own, or just who knows what the emergency is, a little bit about your disability and any information that would help somebody, such as if you have limited sensitivity in areas of your body, to note that so that, first responders can check for injury, because you may not feel it. You may not be conscious. Information about if you use a power chair, let's face it, often people are not evacuated with power wheelchairs, right? Because they're heavy. And if you have to get out quickly, it can take 2 to 4 people or more to lift somebody seated in their power chair. Do you have a manual chair? Because it's better to be evacuated with a manual chair versus none, right? I know it's not ideal, but if you have it, it should be somewhere where somebody can easily get it, and it should be in your kit telling people where to find it. In that description too, you can describe, a little bit about your disability, the safest way to transfer you if they would need to. I talked about medications, dosages, health information, list of food and drug allergies. And if you do have those, wear a medical alert bracelet. That's something that, somebody would check right away. If you have a hearing disability, there may not be an interpreter right there. So sometimes having like a pad of paper and pencil or pen in your kit so that if you have to do written communication, it's readily available. Also think about communication cards, if you're familiar with that. I actually brought a couple. If anybody's interested, I can pass them around or leave them on the table. This is one for people who are deaf. It says, I am deaf or hard of hearing, and gives some communication tips and symbols for when reacting with first responders. There's also one with emergency contact that has icons and images. I have another one that was interesting. This was part of a study in the UK, and they wrote out rights, a person's rights, like if they were arrested or in an emergency situation, and they called them widgets. And so it's written out in print, but also has icons if somebody doesn't, can't, so whatever's easiest, because depending on the disability, sometimes following the images is easier to understand. And then the last thing that I wanted to share, and I was talking about ADAPT, and the reason I wanted to say that is I sometimes think ADAPT activists, I hope, should be prepared for emergencies, because we sometimes have gone out on actions and had to sleep out for days at a time or over a week. And early on in the movement, the activists learned you can't control the situation. We might go and do a protest that we think is going to last 4 hours that turns into days, right? And so I was thinking about it when I was driving here from Tucson. I'm like, oh yeah, I always feel like when I go on an ADAPT action, it's like everybody takes, snacks to share, all of your medications, and we fill out emergency contact forms, and we plan for at least 72 hours to have everything that you need, extra catheters and non-latex gloves, everything you need to survive for at least 72 hours. And it's like a big family, and as things come up and people need things, we share with each other. And the emergency contact, just even for an ADAPT action, we have a full-page form, and people have to designate an emergency contact for the action, list all of their medications, frequency, dosages, and we remind people over and over again, make sure you have all your medications in the prescription bottles with you and anything that you need. My brother, the brother I just went to see in California, used to laugh because I go and do civil disobedience and have been arrested countless times for disability rights. And my emergency contact was always my brother, who was the cop. Because I figured he will always answer the phone and knew everything about me. Like he was the one who just knew my whole history and would know anything if there was an emergency. So the last thing is, you heard about the program that was focusing on really assisting officers with individuals with mental health, behavioral health disabilities. The other thing, just two things that I learned recently around the country that I thought were kind of innovative is the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania Police Department recently got a comfort dog that is in training to be a therapy dog. And they got it kind of in the aftermath of the Tree of Life massacre, the synagogue where 11 people were killed. And the dog, they named the dog Zane, which is Hebrew for gift or prayed for. And they used the dog to actually do debriefing with the first responders after that crisis. And so now the dog is in training as a therapy dog. He's still a puppy, and they're planning to then use them in all types of situations, like debriefing to help first responders, but then also to work with victims, or maybe not victims, but Glendale has that? Okay. So I moved here from Philadelphia, and I'm formerly from Pittsburgh, so I know lots of Pennsylvania stuff. And then the last thing I learned about came out of Minnesota. Is anybody from Minnesota? Oh, you are? Okay. So I'm not real in tune with Minnesota, but I thought this was really interesting. A couple years ago, and the reason I'm mentioning it, they're about to go national, there were these IT or techie guys who wanted to do something. They heard about some situations going on with first responders and people with disabilities, and they decided, we think we can help through technology. And so they worked with the Autism Society of Minnesota and a local police officer who also had a child on the spectrum, and developed it's called Vitals app. Has anybody heard of this? And so it allows individuals with disabilities to share a personalized digital profile with authorized first responders. So the person with the disability wears this Bluetooth beacon, and then any first responders who have the app on their phone, when they come within 80 feet, I think it's 80 feet, but it's close proximity of the individual, this digital profile will immediately pop up on the first responder's phone, and it's whatever you share. So, and it's really for individuals if you, it could be somebody on the spectrum with a psychiatric disability, or anybody, anxiety can take over and create a lot of stuff for us, right? Or somebody who's deaf, and it'll pop up and give name, identification information, and whatever you want to share about the disability, such as communication tips. You could say, I am deaf, and alerting them, I can't hear you. And here are some tips, like don't shine the light in my face because I'm trying to read your lips. Or, how to, just tips for de-escalating a situation. And so it even allows the ability for a family member or caregiver to download like a short little video that will come up for the individual to kind of calm and say, hey, this person is trying to help you, and also give some tips to calm the person. And just the example, what they found, I'm almost done, a community, they got the entire community involved. And there was this one individual, he was 17, who was on the spectrum and blind. And he was with friends, and he was spotted by transit cops on the tracks. And they told them, get up to the platform. Well, Marcus didn't respond, and he didn't respond when he was asked to produce ID. And the police tried to restrain him, and he, being on the spectrum, has some personal space issues, and so it went badly, and he ended up in the hospital. A little after that, there was another similar situation, and this Vitals community team heard about it, and they reached out to him and his mother and asked him to be part of the focus group and get involved. And then they found later there was a third situation, and first responders were able to de-escalate within a matter of minutes without incident. So that's just one story. So it's just, and I just read that there are different police stations in Minnesota using it, and they're now promoting it and about to launch it nationally. I'm not saying it's the answer, I just thought it was an interesting tool that I hadn't heard about. So I will wrap up. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.